history, a matchless writer. He is twice winner of the National Book Award, twice winner of the Pulitzer Prize, and in December 2006, he received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. His books have been praised for their scholarship, their understanding of American life, their vibrant prose, and insight into individual character. Mr. McCullough's most recent book, 1776, the #1 New York Times national bestseller in both hardcover and paperback, has been called brilliant, powerful, a classic. There are 3 million copies in print, while Mr. McCullough's previous work, John Adams, remains one of the most critically acclaimed and widely read American biographies of all time. It is presently in its 63rd printing. John Adams, the 7-part miniseries on HBO, produced by Tom Hanks and starring Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney, was one of the most acclaimed and talked about television events of the year. Mr. McCullough's other books include The Johnstown Flood, The Great Bridge, The Path Between the Seas, Mornings on Horseback, Brave Companions, and Truman. His work has been published in 10 languages, and in all, nearly 9 million copies are in print. As may be said of few writers, none of his books have ever been out of print. David McCullough is as well twice a winner of the prestigious Francis Parkman Prize, and for his work overall, he has been honored by the National Book Foundation Distinguished Contribution to American Letters Award and the National Humanities Medal. He has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and has received more than 41 honorary degrees. He received one here at the University of Utah. In a crowded, productive career, he has been an editor, essayist, teacher, lecturer, and familiar presence on public television as host of the Smithsonian World, The American Experience, and narrator of numerous documentaries, including the Civil War. He is also the narrator's voice on the movie Seabiscuit. A gifted speaker, Mr. McCullough has lectured in all parts of the country and abroad, as well as at the White House. He is also one of the few private citizens to speak before a joint session of Congress. Born in Pittsburgh, Mr. McCullough was educated there and at Yale, where he was graduated with honors in English literature. He's an avid reader, traveler, and has enjoyed a lifelong interest in art and architecture. He is as well a devoted painter. Mr. McCullough and his wife Rosalie Barnes McCullough have 5 children and 18 grandchildren. He is currently working on a book about Americans in Paris from the 1830s to the 1930s. Please welcome David McCullough.
Thank you. Thanks. Good morning, class. And thank you, Gail. What a privilege to be introduced by Gail Miller, and what a privilege to be invited to speak to all of you. I will state right at the beginning and from the heart that I don't think there are any more important people in our society than you who are teachers. And I don't think anybody in our society does more important work of long-lasting value than you teachers. And if I can say a few things to you this morning that are helpful to you in your work, I will be immensely gratified. I have lectured and spoken in colleges and universities. I have taught as a visiting professor in colleges and universities, all in every state, for over the last 25 years and more. I've also taken classes, done classes in grade school and high school. And I have always felt at the end of those days that my time had never been better spent because of so much that I got from the students and that I've gotten from the teachers who invited me to take part in their programs. A short while back on a campus in California, during the question and answer period following a talk that I gave, I was asked the following: aside from Harry Truman and John Adams, how many other presidents have you interviewed? Appearances notwithstanding, I did not know either Mr. Truman or Mr. Adams. But in many ways, I feel that I do know them better than I know people in real life, because I spent so much time with them and inside their world and inside their minds, because they left such an abundance of letters and diaries that fill in all the blanks, particularly with a man like John Adams, who never stopped writing, and who, because of his devotion to his wife Abigail, his extraordinary wife Abigail, we have in excess of 1,000 letters just between the two of them, and neither one was capable of writing a short letter or a dull one. And I know, because they said so again and again, how much their education meant to them and how much individual teachers meant to them. And indeed, in my work on a number of leaders in our history as a nation, I have found again and again reference to specific teachers and how they changed the lives of those individuals, and thus, consequently, affected the history of our country. I am, as Mrs. Miller said, working on a book about Americans in Paris. And among the Americans who went to Paris in the mid part of the 19th century were a great many medical students, because Paris was the medical capital of the world. It was the place where one could get the finest medical education anywhere. It was decades, literally, ahead of American medicine at the time here. And one of them was Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who wrote the wonderful poem, popular poem, To Old Ironsides, the USS Constitution, who was an essayist and poet most of his life, and known for that. But Oliver Wendell Holmes was also a physician who studied medicine in Paris in the 1830s and wrote home wonderful letters depicting his whole life there and the curriculum and how much they were learning and how difficult it was. And also how much he was getting from just being in Paris, surrounded by such culture and love of learning and such splendor of the creative achievements of people in architecture, painting, music, and the rest. In November of 1882, Oliver Wendell Holmes retired after 35 years of teaching anatomy at the Harvard Medical School. And he gave a farewell address. And he chose, after all those years, to dedicate his address to a teacher at the École de Médecine, the Medical Academy in Paris, named Pierre Louis. And he attributed his career to Pierre Louis. And he said of Pierre Louis, he had that quality which is the special gift of one born for a teacher, the power of exciting an interest in what he taught. Thomas Jefferson reflecting on his own life, said that Professor William Small of Scotland, who taught science and mathematics at the College of William and Mary in Virginia in the 18th century, quote, fixed the destinies of my life with his, quote, happy talent of communication and his enlarged liberal mind. I got my first views of the expansion of science and the system of things in which we are placed. John Adams would recall his years at Harvard, and Professor John Winthrop, and the most thrilling night of his life until then, when with Professor Winthrop, he went up on the roof of the old Harvard Hall and looked through the professor's telescope at the satellites of Jupiter. Before that, young John Adams in grade school had been an indifferent and totally unpromising student because his teacher had been very unkind to him. He told his father he wanted to quit school. He wanted to be a farmer. So his father switched him into another school where he came under the influence of a man named Joseph Marsh, who, along with being a superb teacher, was an exceedingly kind man. Because of Joseph Marsh, John Adams applied for a scholarship to Harvard at age 15 and was accepted. And at Harvard, as he said, he discovered books and, quote, I read forever. John Adams is the essence of the miracle, the transforming miracle of education. A boy who was the farmer's son, who we know could write his name, the father could write his name, whose mother was almost certainly illiterate. But because of that one teacher in high school level, Joseph Marsh, and because of his education at Harvard, and Harvard was nothing like the Harvard we know of today. It was a small academy with a faculty of 7 and a total of 4 buildings, very modest. Because of that, John Adams became the most widely read and the most deeply read American of his very bookish era, more so even than Jefferson. Theodore Roosevelt, who also went to Harvard later on, became an avid student and an avid reader and an avid writer and an avid talker. And his favorite professor was Nathaniel Southgate Shaler, perfect name for a geologist, Shaler, and a teacher, professor of science. And he thought the world of Roosevelt, and Roosevelt thought the world of him. The only problem with Roosevelt was that he talked too much. And at one point, Nathaniel Southgate Shaler said, see here, Roosevelt, let me talk. I'm running this course. Maybe the most influential teacher of the 19th century in the United States was Louis Agassiz, one of the most phenomenal human beings of the 19th century. It was Louis Agassiz who had, on his own, for the first time anyone ever had this revelation, that the northern latitudes in prior times had been shaped by glaciers. And suddenly, for everyone, explanations about the geology of the northern latitudes came into focus. It was explainable. Agassiz had had this idea dawn on him when he was a very young man growing up in Switzerland, and made glaciers a study. He came over to the United States to lecture on the subject and on natural history in general, which was his specialty. And he was snapped up by Harvard and offered a professorship. And in the years that he was at Harvard, he changed the whole course, the whole way in which the natural history was taught, not only influencing the teaching of natural history and all of the sciences at Harvard thereafter, but greatly influencing how natural history was taught everywhere in the country. One of the most interesting men in our history, Louis Agassiz. And he had a very novel way of approaching teaching. In the first place, he would interview a student, prospective student, and if he liked that person, he would say, "You could be my student." That was the entrance exam. He also did not exclude women. Harvard did not take women in those days, but Louis Agassiz accepted women into his courses. And if the student got the impression that he had been accepted, the student inevitably would say, "When may I start, sir?" And he'd say, "Right now." And he would turn behind his desk and take down from shelving there a large jar filled with a pickled fish. He had a great assortment of these pickled fish, and he would take it out of the jar, not too pleasant an odor altogether, and place it on a pewter platter and put it in front of the student and say, "Look at your fish." And he would get up and leave the room and not return until the end of the day. This was called by students for generations excuse me, as the ordeal of the fish. And one student in particular, a man named Samuel Scudder, described it vividly. Many of them described it, but Scudder's is the best of all description. "In 10 minutes, I had seen all that could be seen in that fish. Half an hour passed, an hour, another hour. The fish began to look loathsome. I turned it over and around, looked it in the face. Ghastly, from behind, beneath, above, sideways, at 3/4 view, just as ghastly. I was in despair. I was not allowed to use a magnifying glass or instruments of any kind. My 2 hands, my 2 eyes, and the fish. It seemed a most limited field. I pushed my finger down its throat to feel how sharp the teeth were. I began to count the scales in the different rows until I was convinced that that was nonsense. At last, a happy thought struck me. I would draw the fish, and now with surprise, I began to discover new features in the creature. When Agassiz returned later and listened to Scudder recount what he observed, his only comment was that the young man must look again. I was piqued, I was mortified, still more of that wretched fish. But now I set myself to a task with a will and discovered one new thing after another. That afternoon passed quickly, and when toward its close the professor inquired, "Do you see it yet?" "No," I replied, "but I am certain I do not, but I see how little I saw before." The day following, having thought of the fish most of the night, Scudder had a brainstorm. The fish, he announced to Agassiz the next day, had symmetrical sides with paired organs. Of course, said Agassiz, obviously pleased. Scudder asked what he might do next, and Agassiz replied, "Oh, look at your fish." I have that phrase, "look at your fish," framed in a little frame over the desk where I work, as a reminder to not just assemble material, but to think about it, to look at it, to put it out on the table, so to speak, and really study it. Try to make connections, try to see things in it, as Scudder did, that I didn't see before. I'm often asked how much of my time I spend in my work on research and how much of my time I spend on writing. I have never been asked how much of my time do I spend thinking. And of course, that's all important. And so I feel very strongly that how we learn, I'm not going to tell you how to teach. I'm going to tell you what I've learned about how I learn and what I've concluded about students with whom I've worked on how they learn. And when I say learn, I mean learn so you don't forget. Anyone can cram for an exam. You know it, you've done it, we've all done it. And maybe you've done it and scored a very high mark on the exam. Anyone can blow an exam. You're sick the night before, you're worried about something, you're overworked, whatever the reason. You can do very poorly, much lower grade than what you really deserve. But will you remember it 5 years hence, or 35 years hence, or 50 years hence? How do we learn what we know forever in life? That's what fascinates me. And I think Agassiz was on to a big part of it, and that is we need to figure things out ourselves to make discoveries. And I think it's especially important, and I've run my own experiments in this regard, that lab technique, as it were, which is used in the sciences always in teaching, be brought to the humanities. And particularly, in my case, I have an interest in how it can be brought to the teaching of history. And I want to get to that toward the end of my comments this morning, speaking from my own experimental test that I ran of a kind when I taught for a term at Cornell. But before that, I want to talk about one of the most interesting teachers who ever lived, whom I never knew personally, but I knew one of her students. Her name was Margaret McFarland. Margaret McFarland is someone some of you may have read about or know about. She taught child psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. And all who were part of her program would speak with her, about her, with a kind of reverence later that one rarely hears. And chief among those was the person who reached more students, more children as a teacher than anybody who ever lived, and that was Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. Now, Fred Rogers came from Pittsburgh, where I come from, and because of my work in public television, I got to know Fred quite well. Fred was an extremely thoughtful, interesting man. Much more to him than met the eye in his programming, which was intentional. Fred was both an ordained minister and a PhD child psychologist. And he told me, as he's told others, that everything he did in his programming was based on the teachings of Margaret McFarland. And her teaching, in essence, was as follows: that what matters most in learning, what matters most in the classroom, is attitude. The attitude of the teacher. And her great admonition to teachers was, attitudes aren't taught, they're caught. The attitude of the teacher is conveyed to the student without teaching the student. See, the student catches it. It doesn't matter whether the student is in second grade or 12th grade or in graduate school. Exactly what Jefferson was talking about, exactly what Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. was talking about with Pierre Louis or with Professor Small at William and Mary, exactly that very point. The attitude of the teacher toward the subject matter. Show them what you love, said Margaret McFarland. Show them what you love. Now, you can't love something you don't know, any more than you can love someone you don't know. So the essence, therefore, is to know what you're teaching. Really know it. And the problem with much that's happening today in education, nationwide, is that young people coming out of schools of education have not really majored in a subject. And it doesn't matter whether it's physics or botany or English literature or history. And they are assigned to teach that subject without knowing much about it. And it's not just difficult to catch up with what you don't know ahead of a class, but of course, you can't love it. And we've all had those teachers. They have changed our lives. Miss Schmeltz in 6th grade, come over here, David, and look in this microscope. You're going to get a kick out of this. Carl Cochran in high school, who was both a painter and a writer, taught both English and drawing and painting, and saw no division between the two, who worked with us as students writing, as students trying to learn to draw and paint. Vincent Scully, the great art and architecture historian at Yale, whose lectures were transforming, electrifying, because he so loved what he was teaching. He so loved that world of architecture and opened our eyes to that side of human expression, that aspect of history and culture that we were, until then, essentially blind to. His students number in the thousands, and they speak of him still as one of the transforming experiences of their lives, and I'm one. But there was Maynard Mack, whose lectures on Shakespeare were breathtaking, unforgettable, and on. And you've had the same kinds of people. They knew what they were talking about, and they loved it, and they wanted you to be in on it. And thank God for them. The reach of their influence is incalculable. I think that teaching is a gift. I think teaching is an art form. I think it's one of the most important of all aspects, all manifestations of leadership. You are leaders. You are leading these young lives into their futures. You are shaping them. You are giving them eyesight. You are giving them insight. You are giving them a chance to be everything that's potentially within them. And in my limited time in the classroom and the lecture platform, I have had again and again that immense satisfaction, which so many of you have had, of running into someone that was in a classroom or took a seminar with me years later on a street in Washington or New York, saying, Mr. McCullough, I was in your class and I've never forgotten it, and so forth. And what that means to you, that's compensation that has no possible way to measure. The oldest written constitution in the world, the oldest written constitution still in use today, is the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which was written 10 years before our national constitution. And the author of that document was John Adams, whose life had been transformed by education. It was a paragraph that he thought the legislature would eliminate because it was so radical. Keep in mind, the Revolutionary War is still going on when this was written. And the paragraph said, in essence, that it shall be the duty of the government to educate everybody. And he then went on to specify what he meant by education. And he talked about literature and history and finance and agriculture, everything. It was this polymath approach to the world of learning that prevailed among educated people in the 18th century, that everything was interesting. There were no divisions, no separations. But he then also stressed that the teaching in the schools will include such matters as honesty and frugality and hard work and humor. He said there shall be humor. And one wonders today, when people argue whether or not values should be taught in the schools, if by any chance they've taken a look at that Constitution. Adams was saying not just they should be taught, they must be taught, and he's specifying what some of those values were. If we declare that we're not going to teach those values, that in itself expresses a value. One wonders today, seeing some of what's happening, seeing some of the total lack of conscience and honesty and decency in people who should have known better. Who were their teachers? What did they learn from their mothers and fathers and grandparents? Who was watching over that side of their development? We know now that the brain keeps developing right up into the early 20s in life. It's still being shaped. And we make a lot of to-do about keeping fit physically. What about keeping fit up here? What about calisthenics for the mind? Now, I am convinced and more that we are what we read. When I tried to get my mind and my outlook inside the 18th century, I didn't just feel obliged to read what people like Adams and Jefferson and Franklin and the others wrote, but what did they read? And it's once you start reading what they read that you begin to understand where those values came from. Pope's Essay on Man. If you want to teach a course in history, go over into literature of the time. Go over into Shakespeare, Cervantes. They all read Cervantes. Take down Bartlett's familiar quotations and look up Don Quixote and Cervantes and just look at all the common sayings, common in the 18th century because that was written 100 years before, but common today. We all walk around quoting Cervantes, Shakespeare, Alexander Pope, and we don't even know it. And look and see what these essential wisdoms, things your grandmother told you, and she was right. Honesty is the best policy. Make yourself useful is a very good direction to give a young person. We want to be useful. That's what to be useful is to fill a human need. Take a look at 2 lines in Pope's Essay on Man. Act well your part, there all the honor lies. Washington, Jefferson, Adams all quoted that line in what they wrote. Act well your part, there all the honor lies. Now think what that might mean. Why act well your part? Because they saw the Revolutionary War, what they were trying to do, as one of the greatest historic dramas of all time. And they had been cast in lead roles. Therefore, it was up to them to play those roles to the best of their ability, as they would later say in the Constitution about the presidency. Act well your part. You have no choice. You've been cast in that part. Act it well. Why? There all the honor lies, not the power, not celebrity, not wealth, not stuff, honor. Well, what is that? What's honor? We pledge our lives, our fortunes, our sacred honor. That was extremely important to them. How many people get to read or attend classes or lectures about what honor means? Where is honor among some of our protagonists of today? Every leader needs to be a reader. Not one president of the United States who, in the view of subsequent history, once the dust has all settled, stands out as a significant, important, admirable leader who was not a reader, and particularly the reading of history and biography. And I think it can be safely said that what you read is as important as just reading. Get your students to read the best there is. And I have to say, though I know you all have certain requirements and you must fulfill certain obligations, don't ask your students to read anything you yourself wouldn't want to read. Frankly, I think one of the greatest problems about the indifference to history among young people today are the deadly textbooks. Some are all right, I acknowledge that, but some are so dreary, so wooden, so boring, that if you were told you have to go home and spend 2 hours reading this tonight, you would say after about a half an hour, what did I do so wrong today that I'm being punished in this fashion? There are wonderful books to be read in history and biography, wonderful literature of history, of what the protagonists said themselves. Lincoln's second inaugural address, letters from Birmingham jail, the Oregon Trail, and yes, for young people, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Wonderful. You can't go wrong with that. Wonderful fiction. The Killer Angels is, in my view, one of the best accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg ever written. I've read it 3 or 4 times, and when I taught at Cornell, I had that on the reading list as the first book, and I thought if that doesn't catch them, nothing will. But let me tell you what I did at Cornell. At Cornell, as many places now, they have a 2-week period at the start of each new term where, in effect, every teacher, every professor is auditioning before students who come and look you over to decide whether they want to take your course. And very often what they're trying to determine is how hard is the course going to be and how much work will they have to do. So I decided I wasn't going to give any indication of that the first 2 weeks. I told them there was going to be a term paper assignment like nothing they'd ever faced before, but I didn't tell them what it would be. After the 2 weeks, I then proceeded to tell them that I feel exams are an imperfect means of measuring what one is learning, but just to keep everybody awake, there would be a few quizzes and a few exams. But they would not be as important to the final grade as the term paper. And I told them they could get anybody that they wanted to help them with their term paper. Their parents, friends, anybody they wanted. That's how you do things in life. Get some help. And then I told them you also have in your rooms, most of you, aside from computers or whatever, one of the greatest research devices ever invented. It's called the telephone. And you pick it up and call people and talk to them and learn from them. You want to know what coal production was in West Virginia in 1934? You call the American Coal Association in Washington, D.C., and they have somebody who's there to answer just such questions and will tell you a lot more than what your question involves. And go to the library and tell the librarian what you're working on, and tell the librarian as clearly as possible how much you don't know about it. And in effect, throw yourself at their feet and ask for their help and mercy, because they can lead you in ways that you have no idea about. They can save you time, save you frustration, show you shortcuts, and that's why they're there. If you can teach your students how to use a library, just that, you will be serving one of the greatest advantages, serving to their advantage in a way that almost nothing else can match. Think of it, all that we human beings know all that has been written, all that's been understood about the universe and humankind and music, art, everything is all in the public library, and it's there for everybody for free. All you have to do is walk through the door. And the doors to our public libraries are the portals to freedom. Everybody is welcome. And if you've ever done any research abroad or had any need to use a library abroad, you know how lucky we are in this country. And then I told them about the paper. I said, you're each going to get a photograph, and they did. 187 students with a big lecture course. I gave each one a photograph, historic photograph. In some cases, it would be an etching or a drawing, a Gibson girl, for example, from the 19th century, but most all were photographs. The photograph had a minimum of information provided with it. No two students got the same photograph. And those students was given a photograph according to what we thought they might be interested in. It was luck of the draw. So that the championship football team of the University of Wisconsin in 19 whatever wasn't just given to an athlete. Anybody might get it. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is I wanted everybody to know that's my photograph. That's my assignment. Nobody else has it. And I told them many of these subjects have never been written about, so what you are going to wind up being is the world's leading expert on that subject. I told them also, if you have a photograph that you're not interested in, and you can find someone who will trade with you, you may do that. Out of 187 students, there was one trade, because they get very possessive. We want to possess this thing that we're going to be an expert in. Now, if you're smart enough, bright enough, worked hard enough to get to Cornell, you've learned something very essential in education everywhere in this country, and that is how to read teacher's mind, how to give teacher what teacher wants. I wasn't going to tell them what I wanted, and this threw some of them quite off track, and some of the brightest of them were thrown off track. And they'd come in and say, well, what do you want me to do? And I wouldn't tell them. I said, that's up to you. I wanted them to use their imaginations. So a photograph might say, graduating class, Tuskegee University, 1912. Courtesy Tuskegee University. Sergeant Alvin York, courtesy United States Army. American oil tanker Savannah being sunk by a German submarine off the coast of Florida, February 15th, 1942, courtesy Standard Oil. That's your assignment. Go to it. Some of these young people just grabbed onto it and ran with it and had a ball. And some of them wrote phenomenally good papers. Nobody objected to the assignment, not one student. The only objections I had were for my teaching assistants, TAs. And I said, what's to object about it? They said, well, how are we going to grade them? I said, what do you mean, how are you going to grade them? You know one that's really good from one that's not so hot. You'll know one that's brilliant from one that's stinko. Give them that kind of a grade. Also, Cornell at that time was, as they all still are, beset with plagiarism. Just rampant and unconscionable plagiarism. As if, well, what's wrong with that? This was almost, but not quite, almost plagiarism proof, in that there was no files of prior term papers to draw on back in the fraternity house or sorority house. A young woman from Darien, Connecticut, just as bright as can be, came in and she got the photograph of the oil tanker being sunk. And she used every device possible to get me to tell her what to do. I wouldn't do it. So I said, go back and think about it. So she came back in about 3 days. She said, well, I was thinking I would write about Admiral Dönitz in the German High Command and the whole strategy of using the submarines to pick off American oil tankers coming up out of the Panama Canal. I said, good idea. She said, then I was thinking I'd go to one of the VFWs or American Legion posts here in Ithaca and see if I could find someone who'd been on board a ship that was torpedoed during World War II and interview that person. It wouldn't be that ship, but it would be about the experience of having your ship go down at sea. I said, wonderful idea. She said, then I was thinking I would go down to New York and go to the Standard Oil Company and find out how many ships they had at sea, how many millions of gallons of oil they provided for the war effort, how many millions of gallons of oil they lost, and how many lives they lost from the U-boat campaign, and write about that. I said, that's a good one too. And there was a pause, and she said, well, which one should I do? I left it to her. She wrote about the latter. She wrote about the Standard Oil part in World War II, and it was a superb paper. The young man who got the photograph of Sergeant York came in to me. He said, I haven't any idea what this is. I said, well, what do you mean? I just don't know what it is. Who is he? I said, well, I'll give you a little help. He was a very important, widely publicized hero of World War I. He said, when was that? He had no idea when. He had a vague idea that there must have been before World War II. Well, he wrote a paper that was good enough to have been published. It was wonderful. And he's one of the people that I ran into years later in Washington. He's a young lawyer. And he said, Mr. McCullough, I was in your class. I said, which photograph did you get? He said, Sergeant York. I said, I remember your paper. And then he said to me, World War I has become my hobby. Now you know how that makes you feel. The experiment was a success. And I must say that I learned a lot from it too. I learned how creative some of these young people can be. I learned that some of them, irrespective of how high their grades were, never quite got it. One thing I did do, which helped a lot, I went down to the local historical society and in effect baited the hook. I found out what collections of interest they had and if they had a photograph that went with it. So you'd get the photograph of Miss Minnie Johnson, courtesy Ithaca Historical Society, and the student who had it dawn on them, that must be a historical society here in town, went down and discovered that Minnie Johnson's diary was all about her life in Ithaca in the 1920s and had it all served up to her as a subject of what to write about. Make them work out the puzzle themselves. Give them creative projects. They all have these little mini cameras now. Assign 2 or 3 of them to doing a documentary on a building, a historic building in the neighborhood. Maybe some of you are already doing this. I've seen that work superbly. And work with them and encourage them with your enthusiasm. Fire their furnace by showing them what you love. That's my speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for standing up. It was so interesting, but he is on a tight schedule. This room is famous for acoustics. I think some of you have heard the pin drop or somebody whispering. David said he'd take a couple of questions if you'd like, and if you do, speak loudly. We don't have any microphones up, but the acoustics are excellent. Anybody have a question of Mr. McCullough? Yes, ma'am, over here.
Yes, it was about 20 pages. It was a real piece of work, and they had to have a bibliography. No, what I told them was they could get anybody they wished to help them, and including me, if they wanted advice, once they decided what they wanted to do. I was ready to give them suggestions and so forth, but I wanted them to make up their mind of what they were going to do on their own. Half. And my point was that anybody can blow an exam, or anyone can do much better than they deserve on an exam, but there's no excuse for doing poorly on a paper. You've got the whole term to work on it. You can get all the help you want, including from me, but it's up to you, and you have to do it. And I must say, I emphasize the importance of writing. I cannot stress too much the importance of getting these young people to write, to learn to express themselves on paper, not just in English courses, but in every course possible. It's essential. Nothing focuses the brain the way the writing does. And we've all had the experience of writing a letter or a paper where suddenly we have an insight, we get an idea that we never would have had if we weren't writing. Working your thoughts out on paper is a great old way to clear your head. Yes, sir.
All the early presidents, James Madison and James Monroe, seem to have very little written to them about them comparatively. Do you have any plans, or do you know of anyone that maybe is focusing on that?
I don't have any plans to do either Monroe or Madison, but I am asked that question often, and I think it's indicative of a need that people feel to have something written about them. I think that Madison is among the most important of them all, and a very interesting man. There's so many that need to be written about. Truly, there are. Mason, James Mason, extremely admirable, interesting man. John Marshall.
I think we got time just for one more.
Yes.
We got one here.
He's how old? 14. The Johnstown flood. That's the one I'd advise for a young person. I'm often asked at the beginning of a book, what is my theme? And I make up some idea. I haven't any idea what my theme is. I've got to write the book to find out what the theme is. But about 3/4 of the way through the Johnstown flood, which was one of the worst disasters in the history of the country and entirely the fault of human beings, the theme occurred to me, and that is that it's extremely dangerous, perhaps even perilous, to assume that because people are in positions of responsibility, they are therefore behaving responsibly. They can't learn that soon enough. It's a very exciting story, and there's a lot in it about what happens to children. And I would say, secondly, maybe the book about Theodore Roosevelt, which is about his whole childhood and his childhood struggle to overcome his, not just his asthma, but his fear of life. How that peculiar, sick, frightened little boy who was literally afraid to go out of the house without his younger brother along to protect him, was transformed, so a metamorphosis of a kind, into the sort of the emblem of American vitality and confidence at the start of the new 20th century. It's a great human story, not just a great story in history. All stories in history are human stories. That's what history is, human. when in the course of human events. Thanks. I don't want to go. Keep up the good work. Keep up the good work. Every day what you do is of the utmost value, real, true, pure gold value.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to remain in your seats until our guests leave because of the tight schedule. I just might mention as a personal thing, I've spent the last 2 days with this gentleman, and I personally am asked on a very regular basis, Fred, why are you still working? After being with a gentleman my age for a couple of days, I've got a new answer. I said because I can or I want to. Now I said because maybe I can make a contribution. This gentleman is spectacular. When I was thinking about that, a 76-year-old man walked into the Catholic confessional one day and he said to the priest, Father, forgive me for I have sinned. I'm seeing 4 20-year-old girls all at the same time. And the priest said, when was your last confession, my son? And the old gentleman said, well, I've never been to a confession before. I'm Jewish. And the priest said, then why are you telling me? He said, I'm telling everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending. It's been a wonderful day. Excuse me for cutting him off. I know you wanted to hear much more, but it was most worthwhile. Thank you for attending.